Have you ever heard these questions before? If you were on a deserted island and you could only bring 3 items, what would they be? Or if you had to leave your house suddenly and you could only grab one thing, what would it be? Or have you ever seen this thing on social media where it has all these blanks and it tells you to put in your favorite things using GIFs? It's pretty entertaining to me. Oh, here's a new question that might start happening after all of this. If you had to be quarantined with 2 people because of a virus breakout, who would those 2 people be? Thankfully, I am stuck in quarantine with the 2 people that I would pick. My baby, he's a 1-year-old named Daniel, and my husband, Steve. So I kind of lucked out in that department. Well, my name is Aubrey Moss, and I'm the lead student pastor, and I am so thankful that you have joined us tonight for virtual life groups. I think it is important more than ever for us to stay in community and not isolate ourselves during this time. And the reason I asked you all of those questions was I wanted you to start thinking about what your favorite things were. What is most important to you? Who are the most important people in your life? What are the most important things in your life? Figuring out what is important matters because it's where we spend our time. It's where we spend our time. So if the most important thing to you is your phone, then you're probably attached to your phone all the time. I would say out of the 3 items, or even the 1 item that I would grab if I suddenly had to leave my house, it would probably be my phone. If we're not including people, I would obviously grab my baby first. But if we're strictly talking inanimate objects, it would probably be my phone. What about social media? Are you spending a ton of time on social media? Because social media is really important to you. You like to stay connected with people. You're stuck at home right now, and you feel like that's a good way to do it. Or video games. All right, so I don't play these online video games where you guys can talk to each other and hang out with each other while you're doing it. I'm a little bit old school. Me and my husband, we actually have a Super Nintendo that we've cracked out and we've been playing, and I have to honestly admit to you that I've been playing it way too late at night, so that's probably been important to me, maybe even a little bit too much right now. Music. If music is important to you, you've probably been listening to a ton of music and maybe even looking for some new music to add to your playlist. Or reading. Oh, I love reading. Now might be a great time for you guys to be looking for new books and reading a lot more. Or spending time with those you love most, whether it's on FaceTime, whether you're quarantined with the people that you love most, but spending time with them, even if it's in a creative way. What's interesting is right now, no matter what things are most important to you, that's probably where you're spending a lot of your time right now because you have more time to give. And thankfully, there's someone that shows us what's really important. Jesus shows us what is actually important. See, we live in this me-centered culture where it's all about us. It's what we want and what we think is important because it benefits us. And it's really, really hard to fight that. I have to fight it all the time. I am very competitive it's very unhealthy is how competitive I am. And so I'm constantly having to redirect that and be like, oh, is it more important for me to win? Is that what's most important to me? Is that where I'm spending my time? Thankfully, Jesus shows us what is actually important. And this one time, the Pharisees and the Sadducees, which are religious leaders back into Jesus' day, they're going around with Jesus. He has this giant crowd following him around and listening to him and seeing all the miracles he's performing. And so they've all accumulated. And these Pharisees and the Sadducees, they do not like Jesus and what he's telling people. And they want to discredit him. So they're planting themselves in these crowds and they're trying to trick Jesus and trap him by asking him these really good questions that Jesus shouldn't be able to answer well so that the crowd leaves him and he loses his following. But Jesus is a little bit smarter than them. Anyways, go ahead. We're going to read in Matthew 22:34 if you want to follow along with me. But when the Pharisees heard that he had silenced the Sadducees with his reply, they met together to question him again. One of them, an expert in religious law, so smarty pants, tried to trap him with this question: Teacher, which is the most important commandment in the law of Moses? Jesus replied, You must love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, and all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. But he doesn't stop here. A second is equally important. Love your neighbor as yourself. The entire law all the demands of the prophets are based on these two commandments. So maybe you've been a Christ follower for a while, or maybe you're brand new, but if you have been a Christ follower for a while, be like, yes, I've heard this. I've heard this before. I've heard this: love your neighbor as you love yourself. And we don't really think sometimes what this passage is really meaning. What Jesus is saying is crazy. See, back then, they had the Jews, they had over 600 laws to follow to be good with God. 600 laws. And I'm not saying those laws aren't important and that they weren't good laws, but oh my gosh, could you imagine having to follow 600 laws all the time and then being written down and memorizing them? I would not be able to do that. Personally, I can barely remember what I ate for breakfast, but 600 laws. And Jesus has asked this question where they're trying to trap him, where the Pharisees are trying to trap him, and he says, love God and love your neighbor as yourself. And he says, all these 600 plus laws all stem from right here. And he condenses it down to 2. This is big stuff, guys. Love God and love your neighbor as yourself. I love this particular part of the passage when it says, a second is equally important. So loving our neighbor or loving others is how we can love God. It's equally important. Notice he didn't say those two are to love your neighbor if they're like you, to love your neighbor as long as they're the same ethnicity as you, to love your neighbor as long as they're likable, as long as they're not your enemy, as long as they've never done anything bad to you. Love your neighbor as yourself. Jesus doesn't make that distinction. He says to love others, everyone, all your neighbors. And that's what I love about Jesus. We're talking about stuff that Jesus did. Jesus loved everyone. There was no exception to this law for him. This commandment, love your neighbor, Jesus did better than anyone. He is the best example of that. And this is rocking the Pharisees and the Sadducees. They cannot understand Jesus, which is why they're trying to trap him, why they don't understand, why they want the crowd to stop following him. They're so confused by him. He's changing everything. And Jesus shows us what is actually important. Experiencing God's love and extending that love to everyone without any stipulation. So what are you making important right now? I'm sure you got lots of time. What are you making important right now? Because how we spend our time is a reflection of what's most important to us. So how are you spending your time? Are you making time to spend with God so that you are so filled up with his love that you're able to love your neighbor in bigger ways than ever? Are you making time to love everyone around you? And this is going to be a hard one maybe for some of you, especially your own family. That one's really, really hard for me. Are you taking time to intentionally love others right now? I believe that even in quarantine, if we focus on what is really important, if we really focus on that, we can have a huge impact. Jesus loved God and loved his neighbors. He was the perfect example of how to do that, and he changed the entire world. Where are you spending your time? I'm excited for all of you to get back to your groups and talk about creative ways that you can hang out with God and love your neighbor as yourself during quarantine. And remember, God gave us our creativity. It is a gift that we have. So let's love creatively.